Ezekiel wasn't sitting in a peaceful garden or a candlelit room. He wasn't in a quiet temple. He was far from home, in a land where the sky felt heavy and every face around him carried the same tired question: has God forgotten us? The people of Israel were in exile in Babylon, confused, shaken, disappointed with life, and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. And right there, in the middle of that confusion, God chose to speak. Not softly, not gently, but with a vision so powerful it could snap a sleeping soul awake. The story begins near the Kebar River. Ezekiel was 30 years old, the age when priests were supposed to begin their service. Instead of standing in the temple with incense in his hands, he stood in foreign soil with his people in chains of sadness. You can almost imagine him looking at the water, lost in his thoughts, wondering if his purpose had slipped away. And then the sky tore open. Not literally, but in that spiritual sense where you suddenly realize heaven is closer than you thought. Ezekiel describes it like this: I saw visions of God. Simple words, but they carry a weight you can feel. A storm began rolling in from the north, violent and glowing at the same time. Not a normal thunderstorm. This one shimmered with a fire that didn't burn, turning the clouds into something alive. As it moved closer, Ezekiel felt something inside him shift. You know that feeling when a moment is about to change your whole life? That's where he stood. Out of this swirling fire, he saw 4 living beings, creatures unlike anything a human mind could invent on its own. Each one had 4 faces: a human, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Together, they represented intelligence, power, servanthood, and vision. Their legs were straight, their wings touched one another, and they moved with a purpose that wasn't random or chaotic. Every part of them symbolized the majesty, order, and mystery of God. But the strangest thing was this: they did not turn as they moved. Imagine a presence so aligned with God's will that it never second-guessed, never hesitated, never needed to look around. Their motion was pure obedience, swift, direct, unstoppable. Beneath each being was a wheel. But not just any wheel. These wheels were inside other wheels, almost like something multidimensional, spinning in ways that didn't make sense yet felt perfectly designed. They sparkled like topaz, glowing with a radiance that reminded Ezekiel that heaven does not follow Earth's rules. Wherever the creatures went, the wheels followed as if connected to the very breath of God. And then there was the sound. Ezekiel said it was like the roar of rushing water, or the rumbling voice of an army marching with destiny in its footsteps. It was the kind of sound that shakes your chest before it reaches your ears. The kind that tells you this moment is not ordinary, and neither are you. Above the creatures was a platform that looked like crystal, clear, smooth, almost too perfect for this world. And above that platform was a throne. Not a golden earthly throne, but something radiant, glowing like sapphire. And on that throne was a figure that looked like a man, yet radiated so brilliantly no human eyes could fully describe him. Ezekiel doesn't try to paint God's face. He simply tells us what he felt: fire, brightness, glory, and a presence so overwhelming that even memories bend around it. The kind of presence that doesn't just speak to your ears, but to your identity. At that moment, Ezekiel didn't stay standing. He didn't try to look brave. He fell flat on his face. Because when God shows up like that, pride dissolves before you can even think about it. Everything small, bitter, or confusing suddenly feels harmless against a love so fierce and holy. And then he heard a voice. It didn't come from the sky. It didn't come from the creatures. It didn't come from the fire. It came from the one on the throne. Son of man, stand up. I'm speaking to you. Those words matter more than they seem. Ezekiel was surrounded by a people who felt crushed by failure and by a future they couldn't recognize anymore. Nations around them mocked them. Their beloved Jerusalem had fallen. The temple, once the center of their identity, was gone. And here was God, not scolding, not abandoning, not staying silent, but reaching into their pain through Ezekiel. Ezekiel felt the Spirit lift him to his feet. He didn't stand up on his own. Something gentle yet firm wrapped around him, raising him like a parent lifting a child from the ground. God wasn't just giving him instructions. He was giving him strength. Then came the assignment, one that wasn't easy. Go to the people. Tell them my words. Whether they listen or refuse to listen, you must speak. This was not a mission of comfort. God was sending Ezekiel to a stubborn, hurting nation. These were people whose hearts were fractured, whose hope was thin, whose faith had collapsed under disappointment. But God wasn't done with them. This is where the beauty of Ezekiel's calling shines. God chooses to speak to people even when they're not ready to hear him. He steps into our mess long before we step toward him. Ezekiel was told he would face resistance. Faces that looked hard. Hearts that felt like stone. Conversations that would feel like hitting a wall again and again. But God said something unforgettable. Do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, even if they surround you like briars and thorns. In other words, your calling is bigger than their reactions. Then God handed Ezekiel a scroll, but it wasn't empty. On both sides, front and back, were written words of sorrow, mourning, and warning. God told him to eat the scroll, to take it into himself, to let the message become part of who he was. Ezekiel obeyed, and shockingly, the scroll tasted sweet like honey. That moment captures the heart of this entire book. Even when God's message is difficult, even when it exposes our brokenness, his truth is still sweet because it leads to restoration. Ezekiel didn't know it yet, but God was preparing him to speak life into dead places, to speak hope into bones buried beneath years of regret, to speak vision into people who thought the story was over. And this first encounter, this whirlwind, this fire, this piercing glory, was God saying, I am still here. I still see you. And I'm not finished. Ezekiel's world had fallen apart. His dreams were interrupted. His nation was in ruins. But God stepped into that shattered reality and began writing a new chapter. One Ezekiel didn't choose, but one he was made for. Ezekiel is still standing in that strange, holy atmosphere, his heart racing, the taste of honey still lingering in his mouth from the scroll God told him to eat. The vision hasn't faded completely. The sound of wings, the glow of fire, the weight of God's presence, it's all still hanging in the air around him. And now God begins to explain what this calling will really look like. He tells Ezekiel something that could shake any normal person. You're going to speak to people who won't want to hear you. Not because Ezekiel wasn't gifted. Not because his message wasn't true. But because pain had made the people stubborn, angry, and tired. God knew their hearts. He knew their wounds. He knew their rebellion. And yet, he still pursued them. Ezekiel wasn't being sent to a foreign nation. God made that clear. He wasn't being sent to people who spoke an unfamiliar language or lived far away. No, he was being sent to his own people. People whose culture he knew. People whose history he shared. People who had grown up hearing God's laws but had slowly walked away from them, step by careless step. God said, they may listen, they may not, but they will know a prophet has been among them. Imagine hearing that. Imagine being chosen for a mission where success is not defined by how many listen, but by how faithfully you speak. Ezekiel wasn't being asked to convince anyone. He wasn't being asked to change hearts on his own. He was simply being asked to stand, speak, and let God handle the rest. It's the kind of calling that strips away ego. Then God told him something even deeper. Do not be afraid of them or their words. The fear wasn't just about physical danger. It was about rejection, mockery, loneliness, being the one voice speaking truth while others rolled their eyes or turned away. God wasn't just preparing Ezekiel for a ministry. He was preparing him for emotional battle. And to strengthen him, God did something symbolic. He told Ezekiel, I will make your forehead like the hardest stone, not literally but spiritually, a firmness inside. A resilience that couldn't be broken by stares or criticism or silence. Because sometimes the hardest part of a calling isn't the work, it's the people. When God finished speaking, the scene shifted. Suddenly the creatures, the living beings with 4 faces, lifted their wings again. The wheels beside them began to rise. The sound, oh, that sound, started filling the air like a storm rolling over the desert. Ezekiel watched the glory of God begin to move, not away from him, but forward, as if inviting him to follow. Then something happened that Ezekiel never forgot. The Spirit lifted him. It wasn't gentle. He described it as being taken away in bitterness and anger of spirit, yet still filled with the power of God's hand. It was like being pulled into a destiny he wasn't emotionally ready for, but spiritually prepared for. Sometimes obedience feels like that, your heart wrestling, but your spirit moving. The vision ended, and Ezekiel found himself back among the exiles, sitting silently for 7 days. 7 long days where he didn't speak a single word. His mind was full, his emotions heavy, and his soul processing everything he'd seen. The people around him must have wondered what happened to him. But Ezekiel remained quiet. Sometimes silence is the only way to absorb what God is doing. After those 7 days, God spoke again. This time, the tone felt weightier, almost like God was placing something fragile and precious into Ezekiel's hands. Son of man, I have made you a watchman. Back then, a watchman stood on the city walls. His job? To stay awake when everyone else slept, to watch the horizon, to see danger before anyone else did, and to sound the alarm so the people could be ready. If the watchman failed, the whole city suffered. If he stayed alert, he could save lives. God said, "When I give you a message and you speak it, you've done your part. But if I give you a warning and you stay silent, the responsibility falls on you." It wasn't about fear. It was about love. About caring enough to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable. Ezekiel was being trained to carry a burden that wasn't glamorous. He wasn't called to applause. He wasn't called to popularity. He was called to faithfulness. After this, God instructed Ezekiel to perform some strange, symbolic actions to show the people what was coming. His life became a message. God told him to do things that made people look twice. Things that made neighbors whisper. Things that made people wonder, why is he doing that? Because sometimes God uses actions when words are ignored. The first act God commanded was simple but unusual. Ezekiel was told to shut himself inside his house. No preaching in public. No wandering around. Just isolation. It was a message. Israel would soon face a confinement of their own, cut off, surrounded, unable to escape their situation. Then God said something even more intense. I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth. In other words, you won't be able to speak unless I allow it. Ezekiel wasn't just called to speak. He was also called to wait, to listen, to stay silent until God gave a word worth breaking silence for. It's a discipline today's world rarely understands. And then came the next instruction. God told Ezekiel to take a clay tablet and draw the city of Jerusalem on it, like a miniature model. He was to build tiny siege walls and battering rams around it, showing the people what would happen to their beloved city. Imagine the shock. Israel loved Jerusalem the way a person loves a heartbeat. It was their identity, their pride, their center. Watching Ezekiel build a miniature destruction of it must have felt like watching a slow-motion heartbreak. But God wasn't done. He told Ezekiel to lie on his left side for 390 days. Yes, days. Symbolically carrying the sin of Israel. Then lie on his right side for another 40 days for Judah. People must have walked by, stared, whispered, maybe even laughed. They didn't understand the weight of what was happening. Sometimes prophets carry pain others don't see. God even told Ezekiel what to eat, a small, measured amount of bread and water. Just enough to survive, not enough to satisfy. It symbolized the famine that would strike during Jerusalem's siege. Every detail God gave Ezekiel had meaning. Nothing was random. Nothing was pointless. Every action was a message. Through all of this, Ezekiel's life became a living story, a visual warning, a walking parable. And yet, beneath all the judgment, beneath the warnings, beneath the symbolic actions, there was a heartbeat of mercy. God wasn't trying to destroy his people. He was trying to wake them, shake them, pull them back from disaster. But hearts that sleep in sin don't wake up easily. By the time Ezekiel completed these symbolic acts, the people around him realized something serious was coming. You can imagine the shift in the air from curiosity to fear, from fear to denial, from denial to silence. That's usually how truth works. Then God spoke again, giving Ezekiel another hard message. Israel's leaders were failing. Their priests had compromised. Their prophets were saying peace when judgment was at the door. The people wanted soft words while walking into danger. And God said, "They build weak walls and cover them with whitewash." In other words, they pretend everything is fine while hiding cracks with pretty paint. It's a picture of superficial living. Outward smiles hiding inward collapse. Ezekiel's job was to expose the cracks before everything fell apart. And he did. Day after day, he delivered messages that made people uncomfortable. Messages that confronted. Messages that pierced. Messages that felt like staring into a mirror they wished didn't exist. But Ezekiel wasn't harsh. He wasn't cold. He wasn't judgmental. He was a man carrying God's heart. A heart that weeps before it warns. A heart that would rather heal than punish. A heart that reaches out even when ignored. One day, in the middle of all this, the Spirit lifted Ezekiel again. He was taken into another vision where he saw something that must have broken him deeply. Inside the temple, the place meant for worship, people were secretly practicing idolatry. Hidden rooms, dark corners, private sins. It showed that the problem wasn't just their situation, it was their hearts. And that's when the glory of God, slowly, painfully, began to depart from the temple. Not in anger, in sorrow. Ezekiel watched the glory move from above the cherubim to the threshold of the temple, then to the eastern gate, then out of the city. It was like watching light leave a home. But that's not where the story ends. Not with departure. Not with judgment. Not with loss. Because even as God's glory moved away, his voice remained. And it kept speaking to Ezekiel, preparing him for hope, preparing him for restoration, preparing him for the promise that would come later. A promise so powerful it would breathe life into dry bones. When Ezekiel watched the glory of God drift away from the temple, it wasn't an angry exit. It was slow, heavy, almost grieving. It felt like watching a loved one pack their bags while looking back again and again, hoping someone stops them, hoping someone says, "Don't go." But no one did, because the hearts in Jerusalem had grown numb. Their worship had become a routine. Their faith had turned into habit. They honored God with their lips while hiding idols in their corners. Ezekiel wasn't just seeing a vision. He was witnessing the consequences of years of drifting. And yet, in the middle of all this, God wasn't silent. He kept speaking to Ezekiel, as if to say, "Even when people walk away from me, I don't walk away from my plans for them." That's where the next chapter begins. A new vision, the mark on the foreheads. One day, the Spirit lifted Ezekiel again. He was shown Jerusalem, but not the physical one, the spiritual reality behind the city. And he saw something shocking. He saw 6 angels with weapons, ready to strike the city because of its corruption. But before judgment began, God called out to a 7th figure, a man clothed in linen, carrying a writing kit. God said to him, "Go through the city, put a mark on the foreheads of those who sigh, and cry over all the sins happening here." That line says so much. God wasn't looking for the perfect. He wasn't looking for the sinless. He wasn't searching for experts or scholars. He was looking for hearts that still cared. People who felt pain when they saw wrong. People who hadn't become numb. Because in a world that had gotten used to darkness, the ones who still felt something were precious to God. Ezekiel watched as the man moved through the city, marking those who hadn't given up on righteousness. Meanwhile, the others, the ones who celebrated corruption, mocked holiness, and ignored God, were left unmarked. It's a reminder for every generation. God sees who grieves for what he grieves for. He sees whose hearts are still soft. He sees who hasn't grown cold. Ezekiel's heart breaks with God's heart. As the vision continued, Ezekiel saw the consequences hit Jerusalem. He fell on his face and cried out, "Lord, will you destroy everyone?" He wasn't a prophet who enjoyed judgment. He wasn't someone who took pleasure in being right or saying, "I told you so." He felt the weight of it. He felt the loss. He felt the heartbreak of a shepherd watching sheep run straight into danger. God answered gently, "I will not destroy everyone. I will spare the ones who grieve over sin. And I will cleanse the land so that healing can begin." There it was, that soft whisper of hope woven into the storm. Ezekiel and the elders, the secret door. Later, some elders of Israel came to Ezekiel, probably expecting comfort or assurance that all would be well soon. Instead, God showed Ezekiel a hidden room, a secret chamber full of idols carved on the walls, representing all the things people worshipped in the dark, things they thought no one saw, things they did behind closed doors. God said, "Do you see what they do in secret?" It wasn't about anger. It was about honesty. God wasn't exposing their sins to shame them. He was exposing them because you can't heal what you keep hidden. It's like God was telling Ezekiel, "You cannot guide people who protect their idols more than my presence. Their problem is not the Babylonians. Their problem is their own hearts." The glory moves again. Ezekiel saw the glory of God pause over the temple threshold, as if hesitating, as if waiting for repentance that never came. Then it moved to the east gate, and then it lifted up from the city. The people didn't notice. Their idols were louder than God's footsteps. But Ezekiel noticed, and he felt the ache of it. Yet right there, when the glory left the temple, God whispered a promise that changed everything. A promise. "I will give you a new heart." God said, "I will give them one heart. I will put a new spirit within them. I will remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh." Imagine hearing that after watching everything fall apart. A new heart, a soft heart, a living heart. The people had become stubborn, but God wasn't giving up. Their hearts had grown cold, but God wasn't finished shaping them. This wasn't a punishment story. It was a transformation story in progress. The saddest chapter, Ezekiel loses his wife. Up until this point, Ezekiel had carried God's messages faithfully. But then God asked something personal, something painful. God told him that his wife, the delight of your eyes, would die. And Ezekiel was not allowed to mourn publicly. Not because God was cold, not because God didn't care, but because the death of his wife would symbolize something deeper. The people of Israel would lose the temple, the delight of their eyes, and they would not be able to mourn in the usual ways. It was one of the hardest moments in Ezekiel's entire ministry. He loved his wife deeply. She was his comfort, his partner, his calm in the middle of chaos. And suddenly she was gone. Ezekiel's silent grief became a message, a living picture of what was coming. It's here we see Ezekiel, not just as a prophet, but as a human. A man with tears he couldn't shed publicly. A man carrying both divine messages and personal heartbreak. His obedience wasn't theoretical. It cost him something real. The rumor arrives. Jerusalem has fallen. Months later, a refugee arrived from Jerusalem. Breathless, dust-covered, broken. He announced the news Ezekiel had been warning about. The city has fallen. Jerusalem was gone. The temple was destroyed. The walls were torn down. The people were scattered. And suddenly, everything Ezekiel had been saying made sense to the exiles. Shock hit them. Grief hit them. Silence followed. The disaster Ezekiel described wasn't symbolic anymore. It was real. And this is the turning point. Up until this moment, Ezekiel's messages were mostly warnings, judgment, consequences, rebuke. But now the warnings had come true. And God shifted the tone. Because God's heart doesn't end with destruction. It begins again with hope. God promises shepherds who actually care. God told Ezekiel, "My people are like sheep without a shepherd. Their leaders abandon them. But I myself will search for my sheep. I will gather them from every place they were scattered." It was personal, tender, father-like. God wasn't talking about armies or politics. He was talking about hearts, about protection, about belonging. He promised, "I will give them one shepherd, a true shepherd from the line of David." This wasn't just about coming home from exile. This was pointing to something bigger. Someone bigger. Someone who would heal broken hearts, restore wandering souls, and bring God's presence back to his people forever. The Valley of Dry Bones, a turning point. After all the grief, after the judgment, after the collapse of Jerusalem, God gave Ezekiel one of the most famous visions in the entire Bible. A valley full of dry bones. Not wounded bodies. Not sick people. Not even skeletons. Dry bones. Sun-bleached. Long dead. Beyond hope. And God asked Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel didn't say yes or no. He said, "Lord, only you know." Because Ezekiel had seen enough to understand that God can restore anything, but he didn't pretend to know how. Then God said, "Prophesy to these bones." Ezekiel must have felt strange speaking to bones, but he obeyed. As he spoke, something unbelievable happened. A sound. A rattling. Movement. Bones began to slide toward each other, forming skeletons, then muscles, then skin. But they were still lifeless. So God said, "Speak to the breath." And when Ezekiel did, God's breath, his spirit, rushed into them, and they stood up, a vast army, full of life, full of strength, full of purpose. It was God saying, "No matter how dead something looks, I can bring it back. No matter how broken a nation is, no matter how far a heart has wandered, no matter how shattered a family feels, my breath can restore it." This vision wasn't just about Israel. It was about hope for every generation that feels buried under disappointment. Every person who thinks God has moved on without them. Ezekiel watched the impossible become reality right before his eyes. A new covenant. God's presence will return. After the Valley of Dry Bones, God showed Ezekiel 2 sticks, one representing Judah, the other Israel. He told him to join them together, so they became one. It was a picture of unity, healing, and restoration. Then God gave the ultimate promise. "I will make a covenant of peace with them. I will put my sanctuary among them forever. I will be their God, and they will be my people." The glory that left the temple would one day return, but this time, not a glory inside a building. A glory inside hearts. A glory no army could destroy. No exile could erase. No sin could cancel. A glory that would come through the shepherd from David's line, the one Ezekiel had been pointing toward all along. And the story isn't done yet. The promise of restoration was still echoing in Ezekiel's spirit. A valley of dry bones had come back to life. 2 broken nations were shown becoming one again. A covenant of peace had been spoken by God himself. But Ezekiel's journey wasn't done. God had more to show him. Things beyond Israel's return from exile, things stretching far into the future. And the next vision was one Ezekiel would never forget. A warning about the distant future, the war of Gog and Magog. One day, God spoke to Ezekiel again. But this time, the tone shifted. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't even about the near future. It was about a time still far ahead. A moment when the world would face a final, dark uprising against God's people. God said, "Son of man, turn your face toward Gog, of the land of Magog." Ezekiel didn't know these names from any map of his day. This wasn't a local warning. It was global, symbolic, massive. Gog represented a final enemy, not tied to one nation, but to the deeper rebellion in humanity. An army rising with arrogance, thinking it could overthrow God's people once they were restored. God showed Ezekiel this. In the distant future, when Israel is living in peace, when the land is rebuilt, when the people are calm and resting in safety, a huge coalition of nations would rise against them. Not because Israel was weak, not because Israel had done something wrong, but because evil always resents light. Ezekiel saw armies like dark clouds covering the land. He saw nations coming from every direction, north, south, east, west, all joining forces for one massive attack. It looked hopeless, outnumbered, outpowered, surrounded. But then God said something powerful. I myself will fight for my people. Not Israel's armies, not a king, not weapons, God himself. He said, when Gog attacks, my fury will rise. Ezekiel saw earthquakes shaking the land. He saw confusion spreading among the enemy. He saw armies turning on each other. He saw God's justice sweeping through like a storm. It was fast, decisive, final. The message was simple. No matter how strong evil looks, it cannot outgrow God. No matter how dark the world becomes, God's story doesn't end in defeat. Ezekiel learned that the God who carries people through judgment is also the God who stands between them and every future enemy. A new vision, a city reborn from the ashes. After showing Ezekiel the distant battle, God turned the page. The tone changed again. God didn't want Ezekiel to end with visions of war. He wanted him to end with hope, a hope so detailed, so beautiful, so complete, that it would carry the people for generations. And so, God brought Ezekiel into another vision. He found himself standing on top of a very high mountain. Below him was a city, not the broken Jerusalem from before, but a restored one. And a man with a shining appearance stood before him, holding a measuring rod. He said, Son of man, look carefully. Listen closely. Pay attention. Ezekiel wasn't just going to see the new Jerusalem. He was going to explore it in detail. The new temple, beauty beyond imagination. The man began measuring walls, gates, rooms, courtyards. Ezekiel followed him step by step, writing everything down. The details were long, precise, exact. Some people read them and wonder why they matter so much. But Ezekiel understood the message behind the measurements. Order, purity, holiness, a fresh start. Israel's old temple had been corrupted with idols. This one had no space for compromise. No hidden rooms of sin. No secret doors for idols. It was clean, symmetrical, perfectly aligned, like God was rebuilding his relationship with his people brick by brick. Ezekiel walked through wide courtyards that felt open and free. He passed through gates that faced every direction, showing God's openness to all nations. Nothing about this temple was rushed. Nothing was sloppy. Everything reflected a God who restores with intention and beauty. The return of what was lost. The glory comes back. After showing Ezekiel the structure, after walls and gates and measurements, after courtyards and chambers, God saved the most breathtaking moment for last. Ezekiel was standing at the eastern gate, when suddenly, he heard a sound. It was like the roar of many waters. A deep, rolling thunder. A sound he had heard once before, years ago, when the glory of God left the temple. His heart must have raced. His breath must have stopped. Ezekiel turned, and he saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. The land itself lit up with his presence. The air shimmered. The earth trembled softly, and Ezekiel fell on his face, overwhelmed. The glory moved past him, entering the temple, and then God's voice filled the place. This is where my throne will be. This is where I will live among my people forever. Ezekiel couldn't stop trembling. He had seen the glory leave, and now he saw it return. This vision wasn't just about a building. It was about God restoring what sin had taken. It was about hope returning after exile, light returning after darkness, presence returning after absence, the river that brings life everywhere it flows. Then the man brought Ezekiel back to the temple entrance. He pointed. Ezekiel saw water, a tiny stream flowing from under the threshold, just a trickle at first. But as they walked farther from the temple, the water became deeper, ankle deep, then knee deep, then waist deep, then so deep Ezekiel couldn't cross it. It had turned into a river, and this river wasn't ordinary. It flowed east, into the desert, into the Dead Sea. And wherever it flowed, everything changed. The Dead Sea, which nothing could survive in, was transformed into fresh water. Fish appeared, plants grew, trees lined the riverbanks with leaves that never withered and fruit that never failed. Their fruit, God said, was for food. their leaves for healing. Ezekiel realized this wasn't just about geography. This was about the Holy Spirit, a river of life, a river of renewal, a river that turns dead places into gardens. For the first time in a long time, the vision wasn't about judgment. It was about abundance, life, wholeness, a land restored to its people. After the river, God showed Ezekiel how the land would be divided among the tribes again. Not like before, where corruption, greed, and politics decided the borders. This time the land was divided fairly, evenly, righteously. God was rebuilding Israel, not just spiritually, but emotionally, socially, and physically. What was lost would be returned. What was broken would be healed. What was scattered would be gathered. The city with a new name. Finally, at the end of all the visions, God gave Ezekiel the name of the restored city. Not Jerusalem, not Zion, something new. The Lord is there. That name carried everything Ezekiel had seen. A God who leaves when people reject him, but returns when they are ready. A God who brings bones to life, who fights future battles, who restores what sin destroyed, who brings rivers into deserts, and who chooses to live among his people forever. Ezekiel probably stood in awe, letting those words sink deep. The Lord is there. Not was there. Not might be there. Not will someday be there. Is present. Here. After years of warnings, after visions of judgment, after heartbreak and exile, the final message God gave his prophet was a promise of presence. A promise that his story ends with restoration, not ruin. Presence, not distance. Healing, not judgment. And Ezekiel, the prophet who walked through so many dark visions, was allowed to see the sunrise. The moment the vision of the two sticks faded, Ezekiel felt a strange, quiet settle around him. It wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that makes you feel something big is about to happen. He stood there, trying to steady his breath, when the word of the Lord came again. But this time, it carried a tone he hadn't heard before. It felt heavier, deeper, almost like thunder wrapped in compassion. Ezekiel, son of man, the voice said, set your face toward the mountains of Israel and prophesy against them. And just like that, Ezekiel realized the next chapter of his mission wasn't about symbols anymore. It was about reality. A reality that was about to shake the land from one end to the other. He walked slowly through the valley, dust rising behind his feet. The wind brushed past him like an old friend trying to warn him of what was coming. Every step felt like he was walking into a story bigger than himself. Yet somehow, he belonged inside this story more than anywhere else. As he reached the base of the mountains, he looked up and whispered just under his breath, Lord, I am ready. But nothing prepares a human heart for what he was about to hear. The word of the Lord came again. The enemies of Israel believe they have won. They mock, saying the land now belongs to them. But I will judge them with the fire of my jealousy. Ezekiel felt a chill run down his spine. Then, almost like the sky itself wanted to join the message, clouds began gathering overhead. Dark, thick, rolling clouds, the kind that make your chest tighten even before the rain begins. Ezekiel didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood rooted because obedience had become his oxygen by now. As lightning cracked across the sky, the Lord continued, I will restore my people, but first I will bring down every proud nation that lifted itself against them. Ezekiel swallowed hard. These weren't small words. They were world-shaking words, kingdom-rearranging words, and he was the one chosen to carry them. He started climbing the mountain, feeling the rough stone under his hands. With every step upward, he thought about the people in exile, their tired faces, their questions, their doubts. They wondered if God was done with them. They wondered if their story had ended. Ezekiel smiled sadly because he had seen what they hadn't. Dry bones rising, two sticks becoming one, breath returning to lifeless places. Their story wasn't ending. It was just getting rewritten by a God who specializes in impossible things. When Ezekiel reached a high ledge, he looked out across the land. Far in the distance, he could see small patches of green. life trying its best to survive. And maybe that's what made God's next message hit even harder. The voice came again, steady and full of purpose. Prophesy to the land. Say to the mountains, to the hills, to the rivers, and to the valleys, the days of shame are ending. Ezekiel felt something warm rise inside him. Hope. Real hope. The kind that doesn't shake even when everything around you does. He lifted his voice and spoke the words exactly as he received them. The mountains echoed them back like they were hungry for this promise. And maybe they were. Maybe creation itself was waiting for restoration just as much as the people. As he finished speaking, the clouds suddenly parted, letting sunlight pour through like a blessing. Warm, golden, full of promise. Ezekiel stood there quietly, letting the moment sink into him. His heart felt light, almost surprised at how tenderness could follow thunder so quickly. But that was God's rhythm, judgment and mercy, side by side, both working toward redemption. He began descending the mountain, and as he walked, he sensed another shift in the spiritual atmosphere. Something bigger, something future-shaping. When he reached the valley, the voice returned. Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog. Ezekiel froze. This wasn't about Israel's present. This was about battles yet to come. Battles involving nations he had never walked through, kings he had never seen, powers stretching beyond anything the people could imagine. The Lord continued, Gog will rise with armies like a storm. They will come against my people, but I will defend them. I will show the nations who I am. Ezekiel listened carefully, feeling the weight of every word. The prophecy was long, detailed, filled with images of armies, earthquakes, and divine intervention so overwhelming that even the proudest kings would fall silent. Ezekiel wrote everything, line by line, even though part of him trembled at what he was hearing. But behind all of it, one thing was clear. God was painting a picture of victory that didn't depend on Israel's strength. It depended on his. And then came a moment Ezekiel would never forget. The Lord said, I will gather my people from every land. I will restore them fully. I will pour out my spirit upon them. Pour out my spirit. Those words rang in Ezekiel's mind like a bell that refuses to stop echoing. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he knew it was bigger than him, bigger than exile, bigger than history, something future generations would one day experience in a way he could only glimpse. He sat down on a flat stone, letting the wind cool his face. He thought about how far he had come since the day God first called him by the river Chebar. Back then, he was overwhelmed, confused, even frightened. But now? Now, he carried the voice of God like a fire in his bones. A soft breeze brushed against his cheek, almost like reassurance. Ezekiel whispered, Lord, whatever comes next, I'm ready. He didn't know that the next vision would be one of the greatest revelations ever given to him. A vision of a future temple, a restored land, a river that would change everything. Ezekiel stayed seated on that stone for a long moment, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. The sky above had softened, the fierce clouds drifting away as if the storm itself had bowed to God's voice. He exhaled slowly, not knowing that the calm before him was the doorway to the greatest vision he had ever seen. Then it happened. A light appeared, soft at first, like dawn barely waking on the horizon. Ezekiel blinked, trying to understand if this was sunlight or something else entirely. But then the light grew brighter, fuller, almost alive. Before he could stand, he felt a presence beside him. He turned, and there stood a man. Not ordinary. Not earthly. His appearance was like bronze glowing from a furnace, shining with a warmth that didn't feel natural, yet didn't feel frightening either. In his hand was a linen cord and a measuring rod. Ezekiel's breath caught in his throat. The man spoke, his voice steady and calm. Son of man, look with your eyes. Hear with your ears. Fix your heart on everything I show you. For you have been brought here, so that I may reveal these things to you. Ezekiel stood quickly, wiping dust from his clothes, suddenly aware that he was about to step into something sacred. The man nodded toward the light, and in an instant, the scene shifted. Ezekiel blinked again. He was now standing on a high mountain, overlooking a massive structure glowing under the sunlight. A building so perfect, so symmetrical, so majestic that for a moment he forgot to breathe. It wasn't like Solomon's temple. It wasn't like anything Israel had ever built. It was bigger, holier, untouched by war, fire, or human pride. The man stepped forward. "Behold," he said, "the house of the Lord." Ezekiel felt a tremor rise through his body. Not fear, reverence. Deep, breathtaking reverence. The man led him toward the eastern gate. Every step echoed softly, like even the ground respected this place. The gates towered above him, carved with a precision that no human hand could have achieved. The man lifted his measuring rod and began explaining the dimensions, exact, detailed, every wall, every threshold, every chamber filled with meaning. And Ezekiel watched, listened, absorbed. At first, he didn't understand why God was showing him all these measurements. But then something clicked inside him. Israel had lost everything. Their land, their temple, their identity. This vision wasn't just about architecture. It was about restoration. A future where holiness wasn't a memory, but a living reality. As they walked deeper into the temple complex, Ezekiel felt the air thicken. Not with heaviness, but with presence. A presence he had felt only a few times before. The man paused. "Son of man," he said softly, "this is where my throne will dwell forever." Ezekiel's heart raced. Forever. Not temporarily. Not until exile. Forever. They moved toward the inner court. The sun cast long shadows across the stone floors, each line of light guiding Ezekiel toward the sanctuary. When they reached the entrance, the man stopped and gestured for Ezekiel to look. And then Ezekiel saw something that nearly brought him to his knees. The glory of the God of Israel came from the east. A sound like the roar of mighty waters filled the air, shaking Ezekiel to his very core. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of that glory. And the light, oh, the light, shone with the brilliance of 1,000 sunrises. Ezekiel fell face down, overwhelmed. It was the same glory he had seen by the river Chebar. The same glory that had once departed from the temple. But now it was returning. As the glory entered the temple, Ezekiel felt hope flood his chest, warm and strong. This was more than a building. This was God saying, "I have not abandoned my people. I am coming home." The voice of God echoed through the sanctuary. "This is the place of my throne, where I will live among the children of Israel forever." Ezekiel's eyes burned with tears. Forever. A word heavy with promise. The man then took him deeper, showing him rooms for priests, chambers of holiness, places prepared with care for worship yet to come. Every corner, every step held purpose. But nothing could prepare Ezekiel for what came next. The man led him back outside, this time to the door of the temple. He pointed toward the threshold. "Look," he said. At first Ezekiel saw nothing. Just shadows. Just stone. But then, a glimmer.
A shine.
A small thread of water appeared, trickling from beneath the doorway. Ezekiel leaned closer. The water flowed to the east, quiet and gentle, like the beginning of a whisper. The man motioned for him to follow. They walked, step by step, the water deepening as they moved. First up to the ankles, then the knees, then the waist. Ezekiel stared in amazement. What kind of river starts as a trickle and becomes deeper without another stream feeding it? The man turned to him, eyes glowing with quiet mystery. "Son of man, do you see this?" Before Ezekiel could answer, the river surged, wider, fuller, turning into a mighty stream that couldn't be crossed. Its sound was soft yet powerful, like life itself was flowing in liquid form. The man guided him to the riverbank. As they walked, Ezekiel noticed something miraculous.
Trees. Dozens of them. Tall, green, alive.
Their leaves shimmered with a brightness he had never seen before. The man said, "These waters flow from the sanctuary. Wherever the river goes, there will be life." Ezekiel's eyes widened. Life. The man continued, voice filled with meaning. Fishermen will stand along the shores. The waters will heal the sea. Everything the river touches will live. Ezekiel took a slow breath. This wasn't just about geography. This was about spiritual renewal, nations restored, hearts revived. The man pointed to the trees. Their fruit will never fail. Their leaves will never wither. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. Healing. Ezekiel felt his soul settle into a quiet awe. He thought of Israel's pain, their long nights of exile, their brokenness. And here was God, showing not judgment, but healing, restoration, wholeness, a future so alive. Even the rivers carried promise. The man then guided Ezekiel to the borders of the land, north, south, east, west, mapping out the inheritance for every tribe. No one forgotten, no one left behind. God was rewriting the map of hope. By the time the vision began to soften, Ezekiel felt full of awe, full of peace, full of something he hadn't felt in years, certainty. God wasn't finished with his people. Not then, not ever. The light around him slowly faded. The mountain dissolved. The man disappeared. And Ezekiel found himself once again in the valley, the quiet wind brushing his face. But something inside him had changed. He didn't just carry a message now. He carried a future. Ezekiel stood tall, dusted his robes, and whispered, Lord, your plans are beautiful. Little did he know, another divine message was waiting for him, one that would complete the entire revelation. Ezekiel stood quietly in the fading light, his heart still carrying the rhythm of the vision, the temple, the glory returning, the river of healing. For a moment, he thought maybe this was the end. Maybe God had shown him everything. But that gentle pull came again, that familiar stirring deep inside him, soft, but unmistakably divine. He knew God wasn't finished. Ezekiel lifted his eyes toward the sky, now painted in soft orange and purple. The wind brushed his face like a whisper preparing him for what was about to unfold. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Then the voice came, Son of man, this is the law of the house. Ezekiel straightened, every part of him alert. God's tone had shifted. Not thunder, not fire, but something resolute, something final, like the closing lines of a great story. He listened carefully as God spoke of holiness, how the temple, the mountain, the entire area around it would be holy. Not symbolically, not temporarily, truly holy. A place where nothing unclean would enter. A place where God's presence wouldn't just visit, it would live. Ezekiel felt warmth settle in his chest. He understood now, God wasn't just restoring a building. He was restoring relationship, identity, purpose. And then the voice continued, Describe the temple to the house of Israel, so they may be ashamed of their sins and repent. Show them its design. Ezekiel nodded slowly. This vision wasn't only for him. It was for people who had forgotten who they were, for hearts that had dimmed under exile's burden. As the voice faded for a moment, Ezekiel stood still, letting the weight of the command sink in. He wasn't just a prophet delivering warnings anymore. He was a messenger carrying hope, a hope carved in stone, measured in cubits, flowing like a river of life. Just when he thought the revelation was complete, the scene around him shifted again. He found himself standing in the outer court of the temple. Soft sunlight filtered across the stone floors. The bronze man appeared once more, waiting as if he knew Ezekiel needed one more part of the puzzle. Come, he said gently. Ezekiel followed. They walked across the courtyard until they reached the entrance of the altar. The bronze man pointed to it, explaining every detail, its height, its structure, its steps, its purpose. This, he said, is where burnt offerings will be presented again. This is where reconciliation will be seen. Ezekiel watched the altar, imagining Israel standing before God again, not broken, not ashamed, but restored, forgiven, and whole. The man went on, describing the priests who would serve, the order of sacrifices, the rituals of cleansing. each one a reminder of God's desire for closeness. Then something shifted. The man paused, turning toward Ezekiel with a seriousness that made his heartbeat quicken.
"There is more," he said.
Before Ezekiel could respond, the scenery changed once again. This time he stood near the eastern gate, except something was different. The gate was shut, sealed tightly. Ezekiel frowned slightly. Why was the gate closed? The voice of the Lord came again. "This gate shall remain shut. It is holy. The Lord, the God of Israel, has entered through it." Ezekiel's breath stilled. The glory had entered through this very gate. And now no one else would. This detail wasn't random, it was sacred. A reminder that God's presence was unlike anything else. Unrepeatable, untouchable. The man continued showing him the prince's role, the land for the tribes, the inheritance restored. With every detail, Ezekiel's heart grew fuller. He could see a future where the people weren't divided, weren't lost, weren't wandering. God was rebuilding everything from the ground up. But the greatest moment of Script 7 came next. The man took Ezekiel back toward the river, the one flowing from the temple. But this time, Ezekiel looked beyond it. Far beyond. He saw land reordered, renewed. He saw tribes standing in harmony. He saw worship restored, justice honored, holiness alive in everyday life. He saw a nation reborn, not because they were strong, but because God was faithful. The voice of the Lord echoed once more, firm like a seal placed on the entire revelation. The name of the city from that day shall be, "The Lord is there." Ezekiel felt something deep inside him break open, not pain, but relief.
Joy. Awe.
The Lord is there, not was, not used to be, not sometimes will be. The Lord is there, a name that promised presence, a name that promised nearness, a name that closed the wounds of exile. Ezekiel slowly knelt on the ground, overwhelmed by the tenderness of that final declaration. After everything, judgment, loss, heartbreak, God's story ended with presence. He wiped his tears with the back of his hand. Not tears of sorrow, tears of understanding. God wasn't only restoring the land, he was restoring hearts. Ezekiel stood again, solid on his feet. He felt different, steady, grounded, filled with purpose. A prophet carrying the blueprint of hope. The light slowly faded. The temple dissolved. The man disappeared. The mountain vanished. And Ezekiel found himself once again in the quiet valley where it had all begun. But he wasn't the same man anymore. He had seen the future. He had heard the final name. He had carried the glory. And his mission wasn't just to speak. It was to deliver a vision that would outlive him. He looked toward the horizon, whispering the last line of God's revelation. Ezekiel stood in the valley, the wind brushing past him like a whisper of the divine. He let the phrase echo in his mind. The Lord is there. For a moment, he closed his eyes and imagined the people, exiled, broken, wandering. He thought about the grief he had witnessed, the bones, the ruined city, the lost temple. And now, this promise, presence, life, restoration. God's story had not abandoned them. It had been waiting, slowly, patiently, like a river forming deep underground before it bursts into the desert. The Spirit stirred in Ezekiel, and he knew this final vision was not just for him. It was for Israel. It was for generations yet to come. It was for every heart that had felt abandoned or hopeless. The complete restoration. God's vision unfolded one last time. Ezekiel saw the river again, flowing from the temple, deepening as it traveled east. The water spread into the lands that were once barren, turning deserts into fields, wastelands into gardens. Trees lined the riverbanks, their leaves shimmering, their fruit abundant. Every leaf carried healing, every drop of water carried life. Ezekiel realized this river was more than water. It was God's Spirit, flowing into the hearts of his people, bringing life where there had been death. The dry bones he had once seen now stood whole, walking along the river, rejoicing. Families, strangers, priests, and children, all restored. A vision of unity, peace, and divine purpose. The city, glowing with the glory of God, shone brighter than anything Ezekiel had ever seen. The streets were wide and clean. The gates stood open, welcoming every tribe, every people who sought God. And at the heart of it all, the sanctuary radiated light, with God's throne firmly established within. Ezekiel understood now. The glory that left the temple centuries ago had returned, not to a building alone, but to a living, breathing, faithful people. The people and the prince. Ezekiel saw the prince, the appointed leader of Israel, standing humbly at the temple entrance, not commanding, not boasting, simply serving, following God's law, ensuring justice and holiness for every citizen. The prince guided the people, offering wisdom and guidance, always mindful that God's presence was the true ruler of the land. It was not a monarchy built on power or pride. It was a kingdom built on holiness, obedience, and the love of God. Every tribe had its inheritance, every family its place. Nothing was missing, nothing overlooked, everything restored. Ezekiel felt a profound peace settle over him. The promise fulfilled. The voice of God returned, soft but firm. Son of man, the vision you have seen is my promise. I will dwell among my people. I will never leave them. I will heal what was broken. I will gather what was scattered. My covenant will last forever. Ezekiel knelt, overwhelmed. He had walked through visions of exile, judgment, destruction, and despair. He had seen bones rise, enemies fall, and the glory depart. And now, he had seen restoration complete. The Lord had not abandoned his people. He had not forgotten them. He had been preparing every detail, every river, every temple, every restored heart for this very moment. A vision beyond time. Ezekiel lifted his eyes toward the horizon and saw a future beyond the city and river, beyond Israel itself. Nations from afar, once distant and skeptical, now came to witness God's presence. They did not come as conquerors, but as seekers. They walked toward the river, tasted its water, and found healing. They stood beneath the trees, took the fruit, and felt hope for the first time. Ezekiel realized God's vision was bigger than borders, bigger than politics, bigger than history. It was eternal. It was universal. It was love made visible. Ezekiel's role complete. The Spirit reminded Ezekiel that his task was done, not because he had seen everything, but because he had faithfully recorded God's revelation. Every warning, every judgment, every promise, every vision was entrusted to him. His words would guide generations who would one day read them, who would one day trust God's presence even when all seemed lost. Ezekiel bowed his head in silent prayer, thanking God for strength, guidance, and patience. He had walked a path of heartbreak, obedience, and revelation. But he had also walked a path of hope. The final message, God's final words to Ezekiel echoed in the valley. Son of man, tell the people, I am with you. I have not abandoned you. I am here. And Ezekiel understood something profound. God's presence is not a concept. It is a reality. A living force that walks with his people through exile, through trials, through bones scattered and cities destroyed, all the way to life, restoration, and eternity. He smiled. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The visions had been terrifying. The prophecies had been heavy. The heartbreak had been real. But now, in the promise of God's presence, everything had meaning. Everything had purpose. Everything had hope. Ezekiel whispered one last time, for himself and for the people of Israel. The Lord is there, always, forever. The valley was silent, but the weight of God's glory lingered. And in that silence, Ezekiel felt the story had finally reached its perfect moment. The prophet of exile, the witness of glory, the recorder of visions, had completed his mission. The river flowed, the city shone, the people thrived, and the glory of God reigned, eternal and unbroken.